Thank you for joining us for this session on climate-friendly farming. With us today, we have Laurel from the California Land Stewardship Institute. She's going to share some of the key learnings from their climate certification program. And we also have three early adopters, including Silver Oak, Emeritus Vineyards, and Redwood Vineyard Management. They will share their unique experiences because one of the key takeaways is how different sites require different approaches to reduce your carbon footprint, all the while, of course, keeping in mind the need to grow a quality crop on the varying growing conditions. Now, before we jump in, a couple of logistical notes. This session is pre-recorded. However, some of the speakers are available in the live chat. So if you have questions along the way, just pop them into the chat over here and they can answer them as we move along. Also, if you are watching the following Growing Forward session, towards the end of this one, we will also pop in the link to the next one in the chat over there. Now, before we begin, a quick shout out to our sponsors.
Over the last 10 to 20 years, there's been little innovation when it comes to irrigation for agriculture. Irrigating manually is very expensive. Not only do you have to turn all your valves on and off, but you also have to use that labor to monitor your lines. Once the valves are on, how do you know that you're getting the water to the crop that you wanted? You might have broken lines or clogged lines, and all that requires labor, driving around on trucks. And labor's getting more expensive, it's getting harder to find, fuel's getting more expensive. So if you can eliminate that manual labor from your irrigation operation, you're gonna have huge savings. What Lumo is we're a smart irrigation valve, and honestly it's also so much more because we've got built-in sensors, built-in connectivity, built-in computers that allow that valve to not only be controlled remotely but also monitored and managed, so you have complete accountability around how much water you're using on your crop and that it's being used at the most efficient way possible. What our ultimate goal is at Lumo is to help growers conserve their most precious resources, which is time, money, and water.
Okay, let's dive right into this conversation. Laurel, let's start with you. Would you introduce yourself and the Climate Adaptation Certification Program?
Hey, I'm Laurel Marcus with the California Land Stewardship Institute. We're a small nonprofit that's based in Napa, and we work throughout wine country in California. And we developed the Climate Adaptation Certification as a flexible program that growers can enroll in and become certified in and help to increase the amount of carbon they're sequestering, as well as reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. I often get the question from growers of, well, how does soil sequester carbon? And really, it has a lot to do with the soil structure. It's facilitated by bacteria, by microbes, and they create colonies within large aggregates, or blobs is a good word for that, of soil. You see the picture here, in which they can kind of develop and hide inside the safety of that aggregate. And they're able to, break down soil organic matter. And in general, having more aggregates in your soil is a healthy soil condition for growing things. Now, there's different kinds of carbon. So really, when we're talking about increasing the amount of carbon in soil, we want to get down to the two lower columns, the humus and resistant organic matter. Because the other kind goes around in a cycle called the carbon cycle relatively quickly. So this is, you add compost to your soil, it gets broken down by microbes, it provides some nutrients to the plants, and a lot of it becomes CO2. It doesn't necessarily in. So people always ask, well, what practices do I need to do to increase my soil organic carbon? And here's a list of the different things that both add carbon to soil and can result in a loss of soil organic carbon, the production of CO2 emissions, or the production of nitrous oxide emissions. Nitrous oxide is 300 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. So that one's a little bit scary. But you can see here, it has to do with having cover crops, mulching, adding different amendments to the soil, conservation tillage, which is, 50% tillage, something like that. And then there's conventional tillage, which means every row is tilled. Any kind of burning also puts CO2 into the atmosphere, unless you are able to do smokeless burning. And then, of course, the use of nitrogen. If you're applying nitrogen when the vines are not actively growing, a lot of that nitrogen can become nitrous oxide. As soon as it rains, basically, you get soil saturation and you will have nitrous oxide. I like to show this just so everyone can appreciate how complicated the nitrogen cycle is. And you can see here under denitrification, how that is what produces nitrous oxide. So while wine grapes really do not use very much nitrogen, we do want to be careful in the timing that it's applied at and the amounts that it's applied. And this is just a picture showing how much nitrous oxide can be produced in the drip irrigation zone after a fertigation event. So even little small areas of soil where you're drip irrigating, it gets saturated with water and with fertilizer, that can produce. Now, this is pretty much impossible to stop because we want you all to do drip irrigation. But I'm just showing you that every type of agriculture produces this kind of emission. So to develop this, we reviewed and summarized over 350 different scientific papers, all focusing on Mediterranean climates. You need to always use the climate where you're going to apply information. We had our best management practices and climate farm plan template peer-reviewed by 3 soil scientists. So we revised things after that. One of the differences in our program versus others is we use very sophisticated modeling so that the grower can really see how the carbon sequestration process on their property works. And then they can incorporate that knowledge into their management decisions, so that when they're thinking about what they're going to do with the vineyard, they're thinking about how to grow, the amount of the crop they want and the quality of the grapes they want, while still providing climate benefits. We really feel that the crux of climate issues is to make sure growers understand more about this process and they make informed decisions on their own. We don't really want to tell them what. It's not necessary for every acre of cropland to be managed as a no-till system. These are complex systems. There are many different ways to manage farms. Every year it's different. So we have to really make sure that growers understand what goes on when they do different things to the soil, and then they can incorporate that knowledge. Flexibility is key. You absolutely have to have lots of different ways to do things. So in partnership with a number of Sonoma County wine grape growers, you see the list there, we applied the climate adaptation certification to 20 farms. And we did this with our partners, the Sonoma County Wine Growers Association. And we determined a lot of different things. We looked at all the different modeling and what kind of models we had to add to our original program. And we looked at what kind of management practices the growers were able to put into place. And we looked at how do we sustain economically viable agriculture while we're trying to also benefit the climate. So a little bit about our modeling. There's 3 different tiers of models used, and it's important to realize that tier 1 is fairly simplistic. It just uses an emission factor. So that's like, I have a gas burning car, I drive this many miles, it produces this much greenhouse gas. So very simplistic. Tier 2 is a little bit more complicated, but tier 3 is the process-based one, and that's primarily the one that we use on soil and farms. And here's a cute little picture of it. It's called Comet Farm. It's very thorough. It was developed by the USDA and Colorado State University. It takes a while to learn how to use it. I would not suggest to a grower they go on to the Comet Farm website and try to use the model. It's really you will hate yourself after a while. It's very, very difficult. But we've spent a lot of time learning how to do this, and we're basically the only climate plan program that uses this sophisticated model. And you don't need to read any of this. This is just a picture of what the model takes into account. So it really is quite complex. Then there is this sort of washed out version of Comet Farm called Comet Planner. That's a tier 2 model. And this is the one that more programs use. It's not site specific. So it doesn't allow the grower to have site specific knowledge about climate benefits and soil processes. It takes 10 to 12 counties, puts together all the soil types, and then models it from there. So you can see that you just get a number at. So these are different models that we use. Always happy to answer questions from anybody who wants to know more about them. So these are greenhouse gas emission graphs, and very important to understand how to read them. There's a zero line in the middle. The blue numbers above are emissions. The orange numbers below are sequestration. So they're negative emissions, which is kind of hard to get used to, but once you read them enough, you will. Okay, so this is our first site, and we will have a representative from this site talking in a little bit. It has fairly well-established vineyards. They've been there for quite a while. And then it has a Blue Line Creek, Saucil Creek, and several grass areas. We call those natural areas. And here are those same blocks shown by soil type. Soil type is really the crux of how you sequester carbon. You can't really use a soil that doesn't have clay and silt in a fairly large amount to sequester. So when you look up there at the river wash, okay, what is river wash? It's rocks, basically. It doesn't have enough silt and clay. So here we're looking at the modeling results from Comet Farm for the existing practice. It shows you the different types of soils and then how much greenhouse gas emissions come from the soil and how much carbon is being sequestered. The current practices when we did this modeling were a planted cover crop, about 83% of the vineyard in every other row tillage, so that's 50% tillage, and about 17% of the. They use about 0.3 acre-feet per acre per year in irrigation, and they apply about 11 pounds per acre of mineral nitrogen. So you can see here by looking at the different soil types, how the river wash really doesn't sequester much of anything. It's like a net of 0.01. And the other soil types are much, much better sequester carbon. You can see the net numbers down there at the bottom of the block. So this is the greenhouse gas emissions for this site. So this shows you diesel use. That's for mowing, tillage, spraying, harvest. Propane, the little orange line, is for frost fans. And then electricity is generally for pumping irrigation water throughout the site for an entire year. We did a little experiment on this to look at, well, what would happen if we replace the mineral nitrogen with compost? And you can see the compost, because you're putting all that soil organic matter into the soil, it, of course, sequesters a great deal more carbon than just using mineral nitrogen. But the grower has to make a determination if, the use of compost is the best thing for the vineyard. So again, this was just to compare. And then this shows you the different natural areas and the amount of carbon they sequester. We're giving everybody credit for those things, including a hedgerow that the grower put in. And then this is the final slide. It shows you for each scenario what the total is and what that relates to in real world terms. And these are number of vehicles driven for 1 year. So by sequestering under existing conditions, you're taking 4.8 passenger vehicles driven for 1 year off the road. Their emissions are offset. And then this is what you get if you do it with Comet Planner. Nothing really as informative as using Comet Farm. Okay, now this is our second site, very different soil types. And here you can see the percentages of clay, silt, and sand. So these are majority sand soil. Soil that's made up of sand does not sequester much carbon, silt, and clay. So more challenging for the grower to meet their goal. So in this instance, we have existing and proposed hedgerows all over the site. And I've put some hedgerow pictures over here. These are native California shrubs that are planted along ditches, along the edge of vineyards, along roads. And by, planting any woody plant, you're increasing carbon sequestration. And here you can see the comparison of our current practices, which are natural vegetation cover crop, 50% tillage in most areas. And that's because they have gophers. And I'm sure in our discussion, we can get into gopher talk. They use all compost, no mineral fertilizer, and very little irrigation. Now, we keep the practices above, but we put a little bit more of the site into no-till, and we get to a much larger amount of carbon. We've taken 4 passenger vehicle emissions out of the atmosphere versus about half of a car for the existing. So this is our last site. It's a 70-acre vineyard on and 433 acres of natural areas. So what's important about this one is that when you have all these natural areas, all of those trees that are growing are sequestering carbon. And we give growers credit for that. We calculate that into their totals because this is what state parks and national parks and national forests do. And there's really no difference. They don't timber harvest on this land or anything. It's just basically natural. So here's their different soil types. The majority of these are have quite a bit of clay and silt. You can see they have a lot of smaller vineyards distributed over the site. And here is their emissions versus their sequestration. So we have positive sequestration in all of the soil types. The existing conditions that they're using, their current practices are a grass legume cover crop, no-till for 72% of the vineyards, and every other row tillage for 28%. Everything is drip irrigated at 0.3 acre-feet per acre per year, and they use organic nitrogen at 1 to 4 pounds per acre. And here are their diesel use. This is mowing, tillage, spraying, harvest. They don't have frost fans, so no propane. And the electrical pumping for irrigation water is generated by on-site solar panels. Actually, in many places, when we look at what is the biggest emission factor, it's pumping water on these larger hilly sites. And by putting in a solar array, you can completely offset that. And here's their result. So 3 scenarios going from current conditions to no-till to all-till. And by adding in that pretty substantial natural area level of carbon sequestration, they get to take 121 passenger vehicles, greenhouse gas emissions out of the atmosphere. And even if they went to all-till, they'd still be at 115. So you can see by looking at these 3 different examples, just how different each site is when you model it and when you look at the detail. If you are interested in signing up, we have free enrollment right now for Sonoma County in particular. Please just give me an email. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurel. That was very informative, a lot of information there. I'm sure that we'll maybe we'll get to dive into a little bit more of some of the things, but I would like to move on to chat with some of our people here who went through this program with you and hear a little bit about their experience. So Tyler, can we start with you? Would you introduce yourself, your farm, and your experience with this project?
Yeah, I'm Tyler Click, Vice President of Redwood Empire Vineyard Management. We farm throughout Sonoma County. And the pilot program, we use sequester vineyards, which Laurel talked about there, where we have mostly natural areas and about 70 acres of grapes in that area. And the climate adaptation, it really helped us identify, how much carbon sequestration or not we're doing, how much greenhouse gas emissions we're doing or not. And we found we learned a lot about the tillage, no tillage on the property with carbon sequestration. And with climate adaptation, the slide Laurel showed showing 28% of tillage, when actually due to the rainfall this year in 2023, we've actually reduced that to 15% tillage. So we've made a change, allowed more no-till to occur this year. We only have one block that's under conservation till, and the rest of the blocks are under no-till. So that was a nice way for us to learn, and we'll be able to sequester more carbon this year than we have in previous years. And also we have hedgerows on our sites, which Laurel talked about, pretty significant hedgerows, and we planted an additional new hedgerow this year in 2023. We just planted about 3 weeks ago to continue our carbon sequestration on this site.
Thank you. So that's interesting. It's not only just based on your site specific soils and so on, but it also changes from year to year based on where the climate conditions are in a given growing season. You mentioning that you are planning additional hedge rows and such. Is that because you have like are you setting some goals for yourself on how much you want to sequester?
Actually, in this particular situation, this hedgerow is this is a 100% organic site, and this hedgerow is serving as a mode to catch drift from a neighboring vineyard from a non-organic practice. So actually, that's more the purpose. That the additional benefit from the hedgerow is additional carbon sequestration and more biodiversity in the vineyard.
Well, that's a great example of something that serves multiple purposes there. Thank you, Tyler. Let's hear from Riggs. Riggs, would you tell us a little bit about yourself and your farm project?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Riggs Locka, and I'm the vineyard manager at Emeritus Vineyards. Being a part of the pilot program for the California Land Stewardship and through the Sonoma County Wine Grape Commission, came into it in 2020, and we actually started the project on a 30-acre vineyard on the opposite end of town. And with that, that's a no-till vineyard. My vineyard that was shown in the slideshow was the 110-acre one that had the hedgerows all over the place. We actually have a highway that runs right through the center of that property. And so we've actually put in some hedgerows so that we can catch the trash that shows up. But one of the biggest things that Laurel kind of mentioned was the idea of gophers. So we've got a lot of sandy soil. So one of our biggest things is that we can't always just turn it all to no-till because it becomes a safety factor for our guys. We pick at night, and when you're picking at night, you're going pretty quick, and you step into a gopher hole, you could twist and screw up your leg pretty good. So just putting in these different hedgerows, trying to train the trees so they stay out of the way of the vineyard, in addition to not take away any water content, because you saw that we also don't water. So we're a dry farm vineyard. So the only time that we use water is during frost season. But with this whole plan, it's a great marketing tool to be able to tell people that we are, taking 5 cars off the road, and maybe 5 cars isn't a whole lot. But when you talk about the amount of emissions that we're sequestering and what we're trying to accomplish, it works out really, really well to be able to utilize in our tasting room, in addition to explaining our practices that we're using here at Emeritus.
Thank you, Riggs. Brad, would you tell us a little bit about what you guys been doing? Well, first yourself and your role at Silver Oak and what your guys' project has been like.
Certainly. Thanks, Kim. My name is Brad Peterson. I'm a vineyard manager for Oak Cellars in Alexander Valley. I manage about 250 acres up and down the valley. This particular site that we've signed up for the climate adaptation certification is the vineyard surrounding our Alexander Valley winery. It's a 70-acre vineyard, 115-acre property, so there's a little bit of wildlands, as Laurel showed, around the edges of it. And we've done extensive investigations in the winery and in our winery processes as to what our energy use is, what our carbon sequestration use is. We've got solar panels on just about every flat surface there is. So this was a natural next step for us, was to look at what we're doing in the vineyard and evaluate what processes sequester carbon and what processes don't. We're focused on high quality Cabernet, so there's some limiting factors there. We have to produce a certain quality level every year. It just doesn't make sense for us. So looking at the tillage, some years we till every other row. That was a pretty standard practice for us. Certainly in young vineyards where you've got a lot of competition and you need to make sure you get those root systems established and grow some strong, healthy vines, we're tilling every row. But this program has allowed us to understand what those practices, how those practices affect the environment and the carbon sequestration. So as Tyler mentioned, because of the rainfall we've had this year, we're actually 100% no-till. We've gone away from synthetic herbicides, so we're even mowing underneath the vine. So the only tillage we did on the property this year was some fire breaks around the edges and next to those wildland areas. So it's been a great experience for us just to learn that, one, we can do the conservation tillage every other row and still keep our vines healthy, keep the quality up there, and sequester carbon. So that's been a great tool to learn and understand. We did plant a hedgerow. We were learning a lot about hedgerow planting and timing on that. Best to plant them after spring frost is over, much like grapevines. So, but it's coming along, and we're utilizing an area that is just a drainage ditch, and so that once those get established, we shouldn't even have to irrigate those. Should be good to go.
Great, thank you. Tyler, both Riggs and Brad talked a little bit about their tilling practices. What kind of things do you take into consideration when you determine what you can do for tillage over the long term?
Yeah, so for us, considerations are age of vine, like Brad talked about, young vines, root system depth. We've got to look at cover crops. There will be competition for both soil and nutrient for those plants. We also look at vine vigor and vine performance. If it's an area where the cover crop might take water you need to conserve for those vines, then that would move us toward tillage. If it's a site where you don't need that additional water or nutrient for the vine, there's plenty for both the cover crop and for the vine, we go to no-till. So our preference is no-till, but the vine vigor will tell us when we need to till and not to till in a mature vineyard situation, as well as the climate. Like I said before, the rainfall you have that year. If you have very low rainfall, we'll need to conserve that water for the vines, and then we need to adapt and change and till that year. Whereas if we have a heavy rainfall year, we'll want to keep that cover crop. We actually will welcome the competition for water to reduce our vine vigor for wine quality. So that's vine vigor is a big component to it. Also, long term, we need to think about the yield. There's some data that shows that over time, 4 to 7 years, that your yields can actually decrease in a no-till situation. And so we need to consider that. And it might be every so many years you do tillage. And if climate continues to cycle as it has historically, you'll have the dry years, you'll have the wet years. And so you'll have the years that you're tilling and you'll have the years that you're not tilling. So I think those are some of the factors we looked at as far as tillage versus no tillage.
Very interesting. And Brad and Riggs, do you have anything to add to that on the tillage?
Yeah, I would say echo what Tyler just mentioned. It absolutely comes down to what practices work for your vineyard and what you're doing, but understanding what the cost is there. And the Comet program is very comprehensive, but I think we do need to look at it as a great starting point. There's more things to learn. We have been using some compost in different areas to increase some weaker areas, but overall, it looks like a positive, but we haven't calculated in the amount of carbon that's needed to produce that compost. All of those processes take diesel fuel to turn it, to mix it, to haul it, to spread it. So while it's a great practice, I think, like I said, it's a great starting point, but there's still a lot to learn about our practices and where we need to go from here.
Yeah, I think for me, it's kind of the same idea of what Tyler and Brad both kind of echoed. It's dependent on the practices. We've got big gophers down here in my neck of the woods, so I've got to take care of those at some point. And we'll see how it works out in the oldest part of the vineyard. That's the one we've turned into no-till, and we'll see how it works out this year. Getting almost 60 inches of rain here in Sebastopol, that was more than enough for us. We found enough rivers and lakes, and the gophers got flooded out pretty good. But it's just the idea. Everybody's got their own way of doing it, but making sure that we're positively impacting the climate and the earth itself is what we're all after to showcase that ag's the best thing that it can be.
Back to the tillage part there, understanding your soil depth and soil type is crucial. We have had some vineyard sites where we went to permanent cover, and it actually devigorated the vineyard in as little as 3 or 4 years. So we had to go back to a conservation tillage. And it was on a shallower site with a little less fertile soil. So one size definitely does not fit all in farming.
Yeah, and I know, well, that's one of the points that you were hammering, is that you really have to look at the specific site and circumstances, right?
Yes. I look at farms in many, many parts of California, and they really are variable. And you could not just have one thing. And what we find is there's a lot of climate activists who don't understand farming. They don't understand all the different decision-making a grower has to make and how it really varies with how much rain there was, is there a drought, all these different conditions. And they just say, well, everybody needs to plant cover crops and go no-till, and that's it, and be organic. That's often another one they want. And you can't prescribe that. You just can't. And so you have to have flexibility. As you can tell from the 3 farmers we have here, they're all very willing to do things for the climate. They don't get paid for that, right? They're doing this as part of their job. And so we need to have that flexibility to make sure that they can do their real job, which is the crop, as well as benefit the public. So, got to be flexible.
Yeah. And sort of on that topic, I think both Riggs and Brad, you talked about how doing this is part of your company ethos. This is what what the company does, but try and be climate friendly. And Riggs, you talked about using it in your tasting rooms. So I wanted to ask maybe a little bit more information on how you communicate this, and then maybe Tyler and Brad can share on that too.
Yeah, absolutely. So, every month it seems like the tasting room has something else to say. And so when we can bring in something from the vineyard and say what we're showing, we're sequestering more carbon than we're putting out. On a bigger site, that's a pretty big example to throw out there, especially since a lot of our consumers are coming in from cities and they're hearing a lot about climate change and how ag can be bad. But when we end up coming in and saying that, we're sequestering more carbon than we're putting out, and that's even without the idea of knowing what a vine will sequester. So when we go into the idea of what a vine might sequester, we may be sequestering way more than the idea of 10 metric tons to the acre. that's a humongous amount. But when you plant 2,000 vines to the acre, you've got a pretty good amount of woody fruit out there, or woody vines that are sequestering carbon. And so when the tasting room can be able to explain that the vineyard is also trying to be as green, as climate adaptative as possible, that's what it's all about. And so that's why I said that we say those things in the taste room, because people are interested in learning on how ag is being different and how they're actually changing the mindset of people.
Great, thanks. Brad, could you share about that as well?
Yeah, definitely. We try and gather up as much of that information as we can and have it available for our tasting room staff. It's not something that we actively put out. We like to, have our practices demonstrate what we're doing rather than telling people what we're doing. We've spent a lot of time over the last 50 years finding the absolute best sites that we can to grow Cabernet. And we expect those sites to be around for another 150, 200 years. So sustainability is absolutely key for us. We have to keep those sites healthy, producing high quality fruit, and contributing to the, to a better environment for all of those, for ourselves and for our neighbors around us. And so that's really what our focus is when we look at our practices and we try and evaluate how we're going to farm. That is sustainability, and the climate is absolutely as much a factor as any of the other, as yield or as quality or any of those other factors.
Right. Tyler, what about you? Do you is it something you communicate?
Yes, it is sustainability, and then our environmental impact on what we do has been extremely important to us. We were the first certified third-party sustainable operator in California back in 2011. So it's been very important to us, and we communicate to our clients, to our wineries that we sell our grapes to, about our sustainable practices and climate adaptation. We're very excited about this climate adaptation program, and we've signed up 5 additional sites this next year to continue that process. We also communicate with our employees. One thing I did is put on the Ford telematics on our trucks to be able to watch idling, to be able to communicate with our supervisors if they're stopping and talking to someone and letting their truck idle as opposed to turning the engine off. There's a carbon emission impact there, and so that affects our emissions, and we want to reduce our emissions and increase our sequestration. And so we can not only communicate it to our clients, to our winery customers, but to our employees as well.
That was interesting. Very good. So I think something that maybe some farmers looking at this could be interested in knowing is how long does it take to actually start making an impact on your sequestration? I don't know, maybe Laurel, that's something you want to address?
Well, it kind of depends on what the practices are now. So when we model that, then the grower, in our discussions with them, these plans are all very collaborative. We say, well, what kind of changes could you make? What are the 2 scenarios you'd like us to look at? And they oftentimes will identify places to plant oak trees or hedgerows. And, as several of the growers here said, okay, well, let's see what happens if I go to all no-till, or I just want to see what this area over here does no-till. So they'll get an analysis that'll show them what they're doing now and what kind of emissions versus sequestration that produces. And then they can look at the other scenarios and determine if they want to switch over an area to a different practice. Now, we always suggest they're going to go, particularly from an all-till to a no-till, that they try it out on a few blocks before they go completely that way, just because of this whole question of vigor and production, because we don't want them to come to the conclusion that they have to do all-till always. So oftentimes we'll also suggest they do 50%. Because sometimes you have to kind of have a plan over time to convert these vineyards, especially ones that have been all-tilled periods. So, there's also compost. We're a provider for the Healthy Soils program. We do the technical analysis, and they give you money to put compost on your vineyard, as well as lots of other things, and hedgerows and all sorts of stuff. And so, we often will have the folks in these programs will suggest that they apply for this funding and help them get the money. So it's not entirely on the growers in their budget. They can get some.
Great. Thank you. Now, I think we are heading towards the end to wrap this up. So I think it would be interesting if both, with all Riggs and Brad and Tyler, if you each have anything that you want to, say to growers who are looking at this, I don't know, a warning of a pitfall, an expectation, any advice for somebody who is looking at trying to make their farm more climate friendly. So let's start in the reverse order of what we started with. Start with you, Brad.
Sure. Yeah, I would say to anybody that's looking into this, it's a great tool to understand how your farming practices impact the climate. So it's not about how much carbon you sequester. It's, can I change from all till to conventional tilling and move the needle the other direction? Can I eliminate a pass with a tractor? Can I change the timing of my nitrogen application throughout the year to benefit the climate? So it's not about drastic changes in your farming. You don't have to go completely different than you're doing it now, but it's looking at those practices and saying, is there something I can change easily that will help move the needle? And I think that's a really valuable point to this program.
Great, thanks. Riggs?
I think for me, when you talk with Laurel and you come up with a plan, don't think that we're putting in 50-year-old oak trees. We're putting in smaller, easier hedgerows that are very simplistic, and they don't take up a lot of space. Most of those hedgerows, their maximum width can end up being 6 feet wide. So if you've got a road that's 12 foot or 15, you can be able to put in a hedgerow, and you can still hedge it like a hedge. It's a lot of easy applications that most of them are California natives, and they're drought tolerant. So as long as you get them started and get them going, and they're not in during frost, you'd be all right.
Great. Tyler?
Yeah, no, the program has been all positive from my standpoint. It has, allowed us to really, like Brad was saying, understand what our carbon sequestration is, what our emissions are, without really drastic changes in our practices. It allows us to look and where we might be able to make improvements with those practices without a negative impact on wine quality or yield. And it really allows us to understand what we're doing as far as carbon sequestration. It's really showing us the numbers of what they actually are. And I think we're just scratching the surface, and I think we have a lot to learn, but it's been a very positive experience for us. And, for us, finding out that we actually sequester more carbon than we admit has been a very positive experience. We had no idea before this program, and now we have an idea of what our practices and what they mean as far as greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration. So it's been a very positive experience for us.
Great, thanks. On the topic of learning, Laurel, I assume that these learnings are things that you also continue to work into the program and make better or improve your recommendations and so on.
Yes, we adapt. We do. We learn every time we do one of these plans how to use the models better. And sometimes there's particular situations that aren't like everybody else. Like sometimes we'll have a vineyard that's next to a wetland. Okay, well, how can we improve the wetland, which they don't farm, to make it sequester? So there's always different little wrinkles in every place that we go and apply this, where we learn more about, how to manage better.
Great. Well, with that, I want to say thank you to all four of you for being part of this, sharing your experience and knowledge. And hopefully we'll see you all again soon in a climate-friendly way.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.